Okay, so these are your notes on Chapter 8, Section 2, Photosynthesis. We're only going to go through the beginning part of photosynthesis in these notes. The second part of photosynthesis we're going to hold off and do next class. So we're back to our friend the chloroplast, and we're going to talk about that space inside the membrane that I told you about a few classes ago called the stroma. And so that's the space in between these flat discs, and the flat discs are called thylakoids. And so what we're going to talk about is what happens in each thylakoid inside and outside the thylakoid membrane. And to do this, we need to know what electromagnetic radiation is. And I know it seems like I just made a huge jump, but we need to know about light as a form of radiation. So light, like all other forms of electromagnetic radiation, travels in waves, okay? So if you look at this picture, what we can see falls between 450 and 700 nanometers. Now, the wavelength of light that you see is what gets interpreted by your eyes, and that's how you see color. So for example, if I were wearing a red shirt, that would actually be absorbing all the wavelengths of light except for red. Red would be reflected, and then it would be picked up by your eyes, and your eyes would process that as red. And so no two people, because the receptors in your eyes are different, no two people will ever see red exactly the same, or any other color for that matter. But what's really important here is the green wavelength of light at 550 nanometers, because that is what chlorophyll reflects. So that's why plants appear green, because they're absorbing the other wavelengths and reflecting the green wavelength. So what's a pigment? A pigment is a substance that can absorb those certain wavelengths of light and reflect the others. So, for example, black absorbs all the wavelengths of light and doesn't reflect, whereas white reflects all the wavelengths of light. And so just like if you take a prism, you can separate the wavelengths of light into a rainbow. That is each of those different wavelengths. So whatever color you happen to be wearing, blue, yellow, red, it's absorbing all those other seeable wavelengths and reflecting the one that you see. Okay, so plants need this wavelength of light to harvest that light energy. And so the way they do it is they have pigments that are in that thylakoid membrane. And the specific pigment we're talking about here is chlorophyll. Chlorophyll is a green pigment in the thylakoids, and it's what starts the process of photosynthesis. So here's a really complicated picture of something that we're going to go through, but we're going to do it bit by bit. So what you need to know about for today's notes are the top left corner where it says photosystem 2, that big green blobby thing, and then the other green blobby thing in the top right corner that says photosystem 1. So we're going to talk about those two processes today. All right, so the first thing you need to know is that sunlight in the form of waves of electromagnetic radiation hit the thylakoids, okay, and are partially absorbed by the chlorophyll. Remember, green is reflected, but this energy allows a process called electron transport to start. Electron transport is going to produce two things. The first thing it's going to make is the energy to make some ATP, and the other thing it's going to make is a molecule called NADPH. Now, NADPH, I want you to think of like the shuttle buses at Disney World, okay? So their job is to simply pick you up in one place and drop you off in another. And then once they drop you off, they just go back to where they started and they do the same thing over and over again. NADPH is just that. The thing that's going to be traveling, though, is the H. All right, so let's start with the first photosystem. We're going to make some ATP. So the way we're going to do that is we're going to take one of the 3 things plants need to survive, those things that you learned about way back probably in kindergarten. Plants need the sun, plants need water, and plants need carbon dioxide. And so let's just talk about the water part. We have an enzyme whose whole job it is to break down water. And it's going to break it down to the hydrogens and the oxygens. And what we really need is the hydrogen. The oxygen is just a waste product. Now, these hydrogen ions are actually going to get pumped across the membrane, okay? And then I want you to think of this like I take a giant cake and I pass it around the room, and everyone gets a piece of cake. Well, if everyone takes a little piece of cake, by the end I'm going to have no cake. This is kind of the same way, except the hydrogens are giving up a little bit of energy as they go. Okay, so we're going to break down 2 waters. That's going to give us 4 hydrogen ions and 2 oxygen atoms. Now those oxygens will double bond to each other to form O2, which is the gas that we breathe. So the plants will actually release oxygen out of their cells, out of the leaves of the plants. Now the hydrogens are going to get pumped, and so remember, when you see the word pump, you automatically have to start thinking active transport. So these hydrogens are going to be pumped into the thylakoid, and it's going to create a concentration gradient, okay? So it's going to make the inside of the photosynthetic membrane really positively charged and the outside negatively charged, because we're taking all these H pluses and we're jamming them against the concentration gradient. We're going low to high, remember. We're jamming them into the thylakoid. Now, what's going to happen is they all are stuck in there and they want out, just like you wanted out of the closet in the analogy I used there. Okay, so what they're going to do is they're going to get out by going through ATP synthase, which we've talked about before is an enzyme used to make ATP. And so what happens is they're going to go through the ATP synthase, and when they do, they're going to give the ATP synthase some of their energy. And once they give the ATP synthase enough energy, it's going to use that energy to make an ATP molecule, adenosine triphosphate, from an ADP molecule, adenosine diphosphate. Okay, so now our electrons are really tired, and so they're going to tag out. We're going to replace these de-energized electrons with new energized electrons. Okay, so now what do I do with a poor little tired hydrogen that has no energy left to give? Well, NADP plus is more than happy to pick it up, and it's going to turn this NADP plus into NADPH. And this is a molecule that's going to get used later on in the second part of the cycle, which we'll talk about later. Just remember that it gets made here. Alright, so we're back to our picture. So it makes a little more sense now because the big green blob in the left corner is splitting that water. Okay? And so the oxygens are going to get released. The hydrogens again are going to be pumped into the inside of the thylakoid membrane, where they create a concentration gradient and come out through the channel protein that is ATP synthase. It's going to take their energy, use it to make ATP, and then those hydrogens, if you look in the top right corner, are going to get attached to NADP plus, our shuttle bus, and become NADPH. And that will get used later when we start talking about the light-independent reactions of photosynthesis. And these are your notes on Chapter 8, Section 2, Part 1.